A mountain on the US-Canada border is cracking from the inside out, and 250,000 people are sitting downstream of it without knowing. This is not a warning about an eruption. Mount Baker hasn't had a major explosive eruption in over 14,000 years. This is something stranger, and in some ways more dangerous. A volcano that doesn't need lava to kill. It just needs gravity. 50 kilometers east of Bellingham, Washington, Mount Baker has been quietly venting sulfur gas every single night since 1975.
Well, now to a scary-looking seismic record from a sensor on Mount Rainier. Those images going viral, but scientists warning it is not what it seems.
The U.S. Geological Survey ranks it a very high threat volcano, one of the most dangerous in the entire country. Not because it's likely to blow its top, because part of it is already rotting from the inside, and when it finally gives way, the debris has a clear, mapped path into 2 countries at once. This is the only volcanic hazard zone in the continental United States where the worst-case flow path crosses an international border. Not a theory. Geography. By the end of this, you'll understand why a dairy farmer 3 kilometers north of that border, in Canada, already got a preview of what's coming, and it wasn't even a volcano. In March 1975, something changed at the top of Mount Baker. Observers watching Sherman Crater, just below the summit, saw the normal white steam plume turn dark, laced with rock and ash. USGS instruments picked up a sharp spike in heat flow coming out of the crater far beyond background levels. By that fall, the glacier sitting inside Sherman Crater had retreated dramatically. Where there had been solid ice, a new acidic lake appeared. Fumaroles vents releasing hot volcanic gas opened in places nobody had mapped before. Puget Sound Energy, which operates the dam system downstream, did something unprecedented. They deliberately lowered the Baker Lake Reservoir, creating empty capacity in case debris came down the mountain. It was the first preventive drawdown of its kind in Cascades history. Then, the activity settled. The mountain went back to its quiet venting. But here's the detail that tells the real story. Nothing about Mount Baker's underlying condition went back to normal. The heat is still there. The acid is still there. And acid doesn't take breaks. Most people picture a volcanic disaster as fire and ash falling from the sky. Mount Baker breaks that picture completely. It's one of the most heavily glaciated volcanoes in the Cascade Range, second only to Mount Rainier. That ice cap sits directly on top of crater walls that have been bathed in sulfuric gas for decades. Over time, that gas chemically weakens solid volcanic rock, turning it into soft, water-saturated clay. That's not a future risk. That's a 5-decade-long process that's already happened. So the real hazard at Mount Baker isn't an eruption at all. It's a structural failure, a chunk of acid-weakened crater wall giving way and slamming into more than a cubic kilometer of glacier ice sitting above it. In that instant, a solid mountain becomes a moving flood. Geologists call it a lahar, a fast-moving slurry of rock, ash, mud, and meltwater that behaves like wet concrete moving at highway speed. No magma needs to reach the surface for that to happen. It can happen on a quiet Tuesday with no warning eruption at all. To understand what could happen next, you have to look at what's already happened once before. Roughly 6,600 years ago, part of Sherman Crater's east wall collapsed. Geologists call it the Deming Debris Avalanche. A massive volume of weakened rock and ice broke free, tore down the Middle Fork Nooksack River Valley, and traveled nearly 30 kilometers, all the way to Bellingham Bay. That deposit didn't wash away. It's still there. Geologists have measured it at roughly 30 feet thick in places. The town of Deming, Washington, population in the low hundreds, is built directly on top of it. USGS hazard researchers have since modeled what a similar scale event would look like today, tracing a flow path through Glacier, Maple Falls, Kendall, and Deming before reaching Everson, picking up speed and volume as it merges with the river system along the way. Everson is the critical point. This is where the valley splits. Here's the part that makes Mount Baker geographically unique among American volcanoes. At Everson, the terrain forks. Part of any major flow continues west along the Nooksack River through Linden and Ferndale, eventually reaching Bellingham Bay, a coastline lined with tens of thousands of residents. But part of that same flow can push north instead, into the Sumas River drainage. And the Sumas drainage doesn't stay in the United States. It crosses directly into British Columbia, Canada, feeding toward Abbotsford, a city of roughly 170,000 people. So the mechanism isn't volcanic at all, in the end. It's hydrology. A river system built across an international border with a volcano sitting at the top of it. Gravity decides which country gets hit. not policy, not planning. Underneath this entire hazard zone sits a layer of infrastructure most residents never think about until it fails. Interstate 5 and a major north-south rail corridor both cross the Nooksack River system. Lake Whatcom, sitting in this same watershed, supplies drinking water to roughly half of Whatcom County's population. Upstream, the Baker Lake Dam system holds back a huge volume of water behind concrete built decades ago. A major debris flow entering that reservoir wouldn't just threaten the dam directly, it could affect water management for towns further down the Skagit River corridor, including Concrete, Sedro-Woolley, and Mount Vernon. The volcano is the visible event. The water, rail, highway, and farmland systems built across its outflow paths are the invisible one. And that invisible system is what turns a geological event into a binational emergency. You don't have to imagine what this corridor looks like when something moves the wrong way. It already happened, and it wasn't even volcanic. In November 2021, an atmospheric river storm sent floodwater down the Nooksack River. Some of it didn't stay in Washington. It crossed north into the Sumas Prairie in British Columbia, reclaimed lakebed that's now dairy farmland, just a few kilometers from the border. The combined damage from that flood exceeded $2 billion. Highway 1 and the Trans-Canada Rail Line were both severed for about a week. More than 1,000 properties were evacuated. Thousands of residents were displaced. Hundreds of dairy cattle were lost. A local farmer on that same Sumas Prairie, whose family helped drain that lakebed nearly a century earlier, watched river water rise across land that hadn't seen open water in generations. That was rainfall. No rock, no ice, no debris avalanche from a volcano 40 kilometers upstream. Just a storm. Now widen the frame. Roughly 250,000 people live across the broader Nooksack-Sumas hazard corridor, spanning both sides of the border. That includes Bellingham with close to 100,000 residents. It includes Abbotsford with around 170,000. It includes farming communities on reclaimed lakebed that are already flooded once from rain alone. This single river system carries an interstate highway, a binational rail line, a drinking water source, and tens of thousands of acres of agricultural land, most of it sitting downstream of a volcano that the U.S. Geological Survey already classifies as a very high threat. Local becomes regional. Regional becomes binational. And the instrumentation watching all of it is thin Mount Baker, has only a small number of seismic monitoring stations, far fewer than better monitored Cascade volcanoes like Mount St. Helens or Mount Rainier. So here's what nobody can currently answer. How much warning would residents on either side of the border actually get if Sherman Crater's east wall gave way today? With limited, continuous monitoring, would researchers see it coming in hours, or only after it had already started moving? What would it actually take to trigger a repeat of the Deming scale collapse, a moderate regional earthquake, accelerated glacial melt as the ice cap thins, or simply decades of acid finally finishing the job on already weakened rock? And if a single autumn rainstorm in 2021 was enough to send floodwater across an international border and cause $2 billion in damage, what happens the day it isn't raining, but several 100 million cubic meters of rock and ice are moving at highway speed? Ending tonight, Sherman Crater is still venting sulfur into the dark, the way it has every night since 1975. The acid is still working on the crater walls, one molecule at a time. The Deming deposit is still sitting 30 feet thick beneath a town that's built its life on top of it, and on reclaimed lakebed just north of an international border. Dairy farms sit on land that has already flooded once from nothing more than a heavy storm directly downhill from a mountain that geologists say has done far worse than that, without ever erupting at all. The mountain isn't erupting tonight. It's just waiting. And almost nobody watching it knows that. If stories like this, the hidden system sitting quietly behind disasters everyone's already heard of, are the kind of thing you want more of, subscribe, because Mount Baker is far from the only one.